Nope. Okay, I'm back down to 5. Am I any better? Not really a fan of having computers do weird things when I haven't done anything differently, but who is? Uh, all right, give me a thumbs up if I'm still skipping or not. Yep, I'm losing full frames. I'm going to restart the software. I don't know what's happening. Sorry. I don't know what's going on with the software. What's wrong with it? I haven't done anything differently from yesterday. It's better? Okay. Uh, okay. Keep me updated whether or not it stays better. I'm keeping an eye out on the frame drops. Uh, but yeah, so Professor Moriarty. Okay. All right, let's keep trying then. All right, Professor Criminal Mastermind, but no one knows it, right? Only the criminal world knows it. And it was so much, this was such an important point that uh, Alec MacDonald, the famous or the nationally famous detective, was like, Professor. And it looks like I just lost 3 seconds straight of frame drops. But so Holmes was like, have you ever been to his office and to his teaching lounge or whatever he called it? Have you noticed the painting behind his desk? It's worth like over $1 million. How do you think a professor has $1 million painting in his office? Something's a little sketchy, right? So um, that's the plot of what happened. Something I've been doing, I did more yesterday, was I took a lot of breaks in reading, so then that way we can analyze what the author is doing. Uh, so we can compare like when he's telling us things, when what he's putting into dialogue, the descriptions he's giving, the point of view, that sort of day. And I think I really enjoyed it. So um, this might be a little choppier in terms of actually plot, but I think it breaks it up enough so in that way like it's still enjoyable. But always happy to have feedback. But yeah, so let's get going on chapter 3, the tragedy of Barrelstone. Now, for a moment, I will ask leave to remove my own insignificant personality and to describe events which occurred before we arrived upon the scene by the light of knowledge which came to us afterwards. Only in this way can I make the reader appreciate the people concerned and the strange setting in which their fate was cast. The village of Burlstone is a small and very ancient cluster of half-timbered cottages on the northern border of the county of Sussex. For centuries, it has unchanged, but within the last few years, its picturesque appearance and situation have attracted a number of well-to-do residents whose villas peep out from the woods around. These woods are locally supposed to be the extreme fringe of the great Weald forest, which thins away until it reaches the towns. A number of small shops have come into being to meet the wants of the increased population. So there seems some prospect that Burlstone may soon grow from an ancient village into a modern town. It is the center for a considerable area of country, since Tunbridge Wells, the nearest place of importance, is 10 or 12 miles to the eastward, over the borders of Kent. So, this is a big description dump, right? We could probably have lived without this. Perfect author. But most of the time, when he says something, it will matter eventually, even if it's in some oblique way. It's like maybe the number of small shops will become important, or maybe the residents will be important. But we do get the general gist of like it is kind of like a small developing town. So the fact that there's a murder and we're among all of these like well-to-do residents with villas, maybe this is an indication that Why is after they said, hey, is there a murder because like he was part of the criminal scene and he like broke an oath or like betrayed Moriarty in some way and this was revenge? Or is it because he was valuable in some other aspect? But it didn't look like there was any robbery, so why was there a. It's hard to believe that it was the second one, that he was actually just valuable for some other purpose. Um, this can definitely turn people off, like having just like this info dump or this description dump, but if at a moment where we haven't gotten into the action, so it's not like we're breaking up anything significant. So it is a little bit slower, but we were already in a slow scene. All right. Thanks for joining us, Justin, even for a few minutes. Glad you could make it. Um, yeah. Hope the airport goes well. Uh, so we're not breaking up like action or like a deep part of the mystery. It's also his book, but I find that hard to believe. We've had a lot of chapters and a lot of books so far. I don't see him needing another 100 words. All right. About half a mile from the town, standing in an old park famous for its huge beech trees, is the ancient. Part of this venerable building dates back to the time of the First Crusade, when Hugo de Capoue built a fortalice in the center of the estate, which has been granted to him by the Red King. This was destroyed by fire in 1543, and some of its smoke-blackened cornerstones were used when, in Jacobean times, a brick country house rose upon the ruins of the feudal castle. All right, so we're getting the idea that this is, again, a very, like, regal, almost expensive place. Small and paned windows was still much as the builder had left it in the early 17th century. Of the double moats, which had guarded its more warlike predecessor, the outer had been allowed to dry up and served the humble function of a kitchen garden. The inner one lay 40 feet in breadth, though now only a few feet in depth round the whole house. A small stream fed it and continued beyond it, so that the sheet of water, though turbid, was never ditch-like or unhealthy. The ground floor windows were within a foot of the surface of the water. All right, so we have a moat. Funny. Um, the only approach to the house was over a drawbridge, the chains and windlass of which had been rusted and broken. The latest tenants of the manor characteristic energy set this right, and the drawbridge was not only capable of being raised, but actually was raised every morning and lowered. Raised every evening and lowered every morning. By thus renewing the custom of the old feudal days, the manor house was converted into an island during the night, a very direct bearing upon the mystery which was soon to engage the attention of all England. So here we're redeploying like the reader's attention. We're saying like, hey, we might have been a little boring at first, this description, but now this is a mystery that's going to engage all of England. We're drawing the attention of the reader back in, even if like we were skimming over the last few paragraphs. It's like, yeah, that was all description and like there are clues hidden in there, but hey, you want to pay attention now, sort of thing. It was threatening to molder into a picturesque decay when the Douglases took possession of it. This family consisted of only two individuals, John Douglas and his wife. Douglas was a remarkable man, both in character and in person. In age, he may have been about 50, with a strong-jawed, rugged face, a grizzling mustache, peculiarly keen gray eyes, and a wiry, vigorous figure which had lost nothing of the strength and activity of youth. He was cheery and genial to somewhat strata on some far lower horizon, the county society of Sussex. So, describe the house, and it turns out it has a moat. It's a very unique house. I think we're going to remember that, right? Even if we don't remember like the town or whatever, we got the general feeling like this is an important house. I mean, how many houses have a moat, right? And now we're learning more, a great kind of guy. So again, it's like not who you usually think of who gets murdered. Yet, though looked at with some curiosity and reserve by his more cultivated neighbors, he soon acquired a great popularity among the villagers, subscribing handsomely to all local objects and attending their smoking concerts and other functions, where, having a remarkably rich tenor voice, he was always ready to oblige with an excellent song. He appeared to have plenty of money, which was said to have been gained in the Californian gold fields, and it was clear from his own talk and that of his wife that he had spent part of his life in America. The good impression which had been produced by his generosity and by his democratic manners was increased by a reputation gained for utter indifference to danger. Though a wretched rider, he turned out at every meet and took the most amazing falls in his determination to hold his own with the best. When the vicarage caught fire, he distinguished himself also by the fearlessness with which he re-entered the building to save property, after the local fire brigade had given it up as impossible. Thus it came about that John Douglas of the Manor House had within 5 years himself quite a reputation in Burlstone. Too was popular with those who had made her acquaintance, though, after the English fashion, the callers upon a stranger who settled in the county without introductions were few and far between. This mattered the less to her, as she was retiring by disposition to her domestic duties. It was known that she was an English lady who had met Mr. Douglas in London, he being at that time a widower. She was a beautiful woman, tall, dark, and slender, some 20 years younger than her husband, a disparity which seemed in no wise to mar the contentment of their family life. It was remarked sometimes, however, by those who knew them best, that the confidence between the two did not appear to be complete, since the wife was either very reticent about her husband's past life, or else, as seemed more likely, was imperfectly informed about it. We have a little twist. While the two seem to be great people, maybe they don't always get along. Interesting. And so this also is part of the draw to the story, right? We don't know why they're not on the best of terms, or that the confidence between them did not appear to be complete. Right, so this is a building of suspense. This is a building of tension, of sort of a thing to remember and to like pique your interest as time goes on. Like they could have just said, the author could have just said, she did not know that he was a widower. Dun dun dun. Like that kind of eliminates the suspense. And although it's not really like a big thing, a tiny bit of a twist, a tiny bit of a little detail that adds to the characters. It's not like all sunshine and roses. There's an analogy, or I like to use, where like a bomb hidden underneath a table for 10 minutes gives you 10 minutes of suspense, whereas a bomb that you don't see and explodes gives you just 1 minute of shock value. So like the fact that we're putting in little details now means that we have a whole chapter, or maybe a whole book, of trying to figure out like what's the suspense, what's happening. You're on your edge of the seat, like how important is this type of thing. All right. It had also been noted and commented upon by a few observant people that there were signs that she would display acute uneasiness if her absent husband should be particularly late in his return. On a quiet countryside where all gossip is welcome, this weakness of the lady of the manor house did not pass without remark, and it bulked larger upon people of very special significance. There was yet another individual whose residence under that roof was, it is true, only an intermittent one, but whose presence at the time of the strange happenings, which will now be narrated, brought his name prominently before the public. Cecil James Barker of Hales Lodge, Hampstead. All right, so because this is a novel, I like keeping track of the characters and the locations that will probably come up again. Intermit. I'm going to spell this wrong. Mittent resident of Burlstone House. My viewer count keeps jumping up by 2, and I'm confused of whether like jumping up and down by 2. I'm wondering if like someone's just logged in twice, or I'm just getting very. Uh, it's just very coincidental that 2 people are joining and leaving at the same time. Okay. Cecil Barker's tall, loose-jointed figure was a familiar one in the main street of Burlstone Village, for he was a frequent and welcome visitor at the manor house. He was the more noticed as being the only friend of the past unknown life, Mr. Douglas, who was nevertheless. Baker was himself an undoubted Englishman, but by his remarks it was clear that he had first known Douglas in America and had lived there on intimate terms with him. He appeared to be a man of considerable wealth and was reputed to be a bachelor. Age rather young Douglas, 45 at the most, a tall, straight, broad-chested fellow with a clean-shaven face, prize fighter face, thick, strong, black eyebrows, and a pair of masterful black eyes, which might, even without the aid of his very capable hand, a hostile crowd. He neither rode nor shot, but spent his days in wandering round the old village with his pipe in his mouth, or in driving with his host, or in his absence with his hostess, over the beautiful countryside. An easy-going, free-handed gentleman that crossed him. He was cordial and intimate with Douglas, and was no less friendly with his wife, a friendship which more than once seemed to cause some irritation to the husband, so that even the servants were able to perceive his annoyance. Such was the third. Notice I did not write down Miss Douglas. Slight distrust of Mr. Douglas. Mrs. Douglas. Okay. Yeah. All right. As to the other denizens of the old building, it was a fight, and Mrs. Allen, a buxom and cheerful person, who received the lady of some of her household cares. The other 6 servants in the house bear no relation to the events of the night of January 6th. Oof, January 6th. Maid? No, the butler. Butler? Mrs. Allen is the maid, I guess. And if we get more details about them, we'll add them later. Respectable. Okay. Onward. It was at 11:45 that the first alarm reached the small local police station in charge of Sergeant Wilson of the Sussex Constabulary. Cecil Barker, much excited, had rushed up to the door and pealed furiously upon the bell. A terrible tragedy had occurred at the manor house, and Judge had been murdered. That was the breathless burden of his message. He had hurried back to the house, followed within a few minutes, a little after 12 o'clock, after taking prompt steps to warn the county authorities that something serious was afoot. On reaching the manor house, the sergeant had found the drawbridge down, the windows lighted up, and the wild confusion and alarm. The white-faced servants were huddling together in the hall, with the frightened butler wringing his hands in the doorway. Only Cecil Barker seemed to be master of himself and his emotions. He had opened the door which was nearest to the entrance, and he had beckoned a brisk and capable general practitioner from the village. The 3 men entered the fatal room together, while the horror-stricken butler followed at their heels, closing the door behind him to shut out the terrible scene from the maidservants. If Dr. Wood comes up, he was given a name, which, on one hand, adds more realism to the world, right? Instead of just like a general practitioner showed up. Like, why even include him in the first place? So giving him a name gives more realism. It's like you actually feel like you're more part of the story. Hey, there's this person. He has a name. He's actually doing something. But some, not all details are always necessary to at least record on his back, sprawling with outstretched limbs in the center of the room. He was clad only in a pink dressing gown, which covered his night clothes. There were carpet slippers on his bare feet. The doctor knelt beside him and held down the hand lamp which had stood on the table that his presence could be dispensed with. The man had been horribly injured. Lying across his chest was a curious weapon, a shotgun with the barrel sawed off a foot in front of the triggers. It was clear that this had been fired at close range and that he had received the whole charge in the face, blowing his head almost to pieces. The triggers had been wired together so as to make the simultaneous discharge more destructive. Okay, brutal. The country policeman was unnerved and troubled by the tremendous responsibility which had come so suddenly upon him. We will touch nothing until my superior dead. Nothing has been touched up to now, said Cecil Barker. I'll answer for that. You see it all exactly as I found it. When was that? The sergeant had drawn out his notebook. It was just 11:30. I had not begun to undress, and I was sitting by the fire very loud. It seemed to be muffled. I rushed down. I don't suppose it was 30 seconds before I was in the room. Was the door open? Yes, it was open. Poor Douglas was lying as you see him. His bedroom candle was burning on the table. It was I who lit the lamp. Did you see no one? No, I heard Mrs. Douglas coming down the stair behind me, and I rushed out to prevent her from seeing this dreadful sight. Mrs. Allen, the housekeeper, came and took her away. Ames had arrived, and we ran back into the room once more. All right, so how was her? Did you see no one? No. I heard Mrs. Douglas coming down the stair. Oh, sorry. But surely I have heard that the drawbridge is kept up all night. Yes. It was up until I lowered it. I got away. It is out of the question. Mr. Douglas must have shot himself. That was our first idea, but see? Barker drew aside the curtain and showed that the long, diamond-paned window was open to its full extent. And look at this. He held the lamp down and illuminated it like a boot sole upon the wooden sill. Someone has stood there in getting out. You mean that someone waded across the moat? Exactly. If I remember correctly, and it is totally possible that I don't, attackers rather than to actually like stop them, because like if you're defending your castle, it's enough to just like make it so you don't get barraged all the time, right? Whereas like keeping like a full impossible, but if you have like a controlled one, and sometimes you have an emergency where you need to get back to the castle without the drawbridge. And it's not like there are alligators in it. Exactly. Then if you were in the room within half a minute of the crime, he must have been in the water at that very moment. I have not a doubt of it. I wish to heaven that I had rushed to the window, but the curtain screened it, as you can see, and so it never occurred to me. Then I heard the step of Mrs. Douglas, and I could not let her enter the room. It would have been too horrible. Horrible enough, said the doctor, looking at the shattered head and the terrible marks which surrounded it. I've never seen such injuries since the Burlstone Railway smash. But, I say, remarked the police sergeant, whose slow, bucolic common sense was still pondering the open window. It's all very well your saying that a man escaped by wading this moat, but what I ask you is, how did he ever get into the house at all if the bridge was up? Ah, that's the question, said Barker. At what o'clock was it raised? It was nearly 6 o'clock, said Ames the butler. I've heard, said the sergeant, that it was usually raised at sunset. That would be nearer 4:30 than 6 at this time of year. Mrs. Douglas had visitors to tea, said Ames. I couldn't raise it until they went. Then I wound it up myself. Then it comes to this, said the sergeant. If anyone came from outside, if they did, they must have got in across the bridge before 6 and been in hiding ever since, until Mr. Douglas came into the room after 11. So something that we're doing with this dialogue is this is something I touched upon yesterday, but we are seeing their thought processes without actually being in the heads of the people talking or of the other people, right? The story is written from Dr. John Watson's perspective, so we only ever get a direct look into his head, only his thoughts, only his direct emotions. We don't get to see what other people are thinking. That would also ruin the mystery. But through dialogue, we're able to see this like line of thought. No matter how obvious it is, you get to write out these things because people always talk about these things, right? But we're getting clues, we're getting details, we're getting thought processes, and like if someone is missing something, we don't get to see that because they only get to see the readers only get to see what the people are talking about. There is no omniscient perspective where Ames said, "Yes, I rose the drawbridge after someone came in." Like we don't get that, right? It isn't like we don't see their emissions because we're not in their heads, and so that's a critical part of both mystery novels and building suspense in general, is that we only get what we're told, and in dialogue you get to be told very directly. That is so. Mr. Douglas went round the house every night the last thing before he turned in to see that the lights were right. That brought him in here. The man was waiting and shot him. Then he got away through the window and left his gun behind him. That's how I read it, for nothing else fits the facts. The sergeant picked up a card which lay beside the dead man on the floor. The initials VV, and under them the number 341 were rudely scrawled in ink upon it. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up. Barker looked at it with curiosity. "I've never noticed it before," he said. "The murderer must have left it behind him. VV 341. I can make no sense of that." The sergeant kept turning it over in his big fingers. "What's VV? Somebody's initials, maybe. What have you got there, Dr. Wood?" "All right. It's been enough times. We can add it." Town General Practitioner. Examined body after. Okay, that's enough. It was a good-sized hammer which had been lying on the rug in front of the fireplace, a substantial workmanlike hammer. Cecil Barker pointed to a box of brass-headed nails upon the mantelpiece. "Mr. Douglas was altering the pictures yesterday," he said. "I saw him myself, standing upon that chair and fixing the big picture above it. That accounts for the hammer." "We'd best put it back on the rug where we found it," said the sergeant, scratching his puzzled head in perplexity. Really? Was he puzzled? "It will want the best brains in the force to get to the bottom of this thing. It will be a London job before it is finished." He raised the hand lamp and walked slowly round the room. "Hello!" he cried excitedly, drawing the window curtain to one side. "What o'clock were those curtains drawn?" "When the lamps were lit," said the butler. "It would be shortly after 4. Something that would probably be more obvious if I did spell practitioner wrong. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. I just said practitioner. Anyway, something that is often noticeable in good writing for dialogue is that you don't need the tags here, like "said the butler." You only need them if it's not apparent, like who's talking. So like whenever you say you see hello spelled like this, you know it's not Holmes talking, because hello is has like an A in it when Holmes says it. So like you don't always need these tags like said the butler unless it's like not very clear who's speaking. But when you add like little details like this, or maybe someone has a lisp or an accent, you can detect pretty quickly who's talking based on how they're speaking or like what observations they're making. Um, just the word hello being spelled differently here is something that's what reminded me of it. That's why I want to mention it there. So like here, for example, we know that the sergeant is talking, and so we see the sergeant's talking. The butler responds, and now here we don't see the word sergeant in all of this, but we know the sergeant is talking again because it's mostly an interchange between the butler and the sergeant. When the lamps were lit, etc. Someone had been hiding here, sure enough. He held down the light. We also know the sergeant's the one holding the light, so that he's the only one who can lower it. And the marks of muddy boots were very visible in the corner. I'm bound to say this bears out your theory, Mr. Barker. It looks as if the man got into the house after 4 when the curtains were drawn, and before 6 when the bridge was raised. He slipped into this room because it was the first that he saw. There was no other place where he could hide, so he popped in behind the curtain. That all seems clear enough. It is likely that his main idea was to burgle the house, but Mr. Douglas chanced to come upon him, so he murdered him and escaped. That's how I read it, said Barker. But, I say, aren't we wasting precious time? Couldn't we start out and scout the country before the fellow gets away? The sergeant considered for a moment. There are no trains before 6 in the morning, so he can't get away by rail. If he goes by road, his legs all dripping, it's odds that someone will notice him. Anyhow, I can't leave here myself until I am relieved, but I think none of you should go until we see more clearly how we all stand. The doctor had taken the lamp and was narrowly scrutinizing the body. What's this mark? He asked. Could this have any connection with the crime? This is something I talked about in previous works, but we're not told what it is this mark is right away. So even if he explains it in the next, even if the author writes about it in the next paragraph, we still have this like little moment of like, what's this mark? We're in the eyes of the doctor. We're in the eyes of the sergeant and everyone else. It's like, what is this? We feel the what's this mark? It's like the come look at this cliche in movies, but because we are in the eyes already of the investigator, of the sergeant, of the people in the story, we want to know what this mark is. We're given a hint at what it is. It's not just like a come over here for plot convenience. It kind of is, right? But we still get that the moment of suspense is a little bit more pronounced when we're reading as opposed to when we're watching. I don't know. It's just something. The dead man's right arm was thrust out from his dressing gown and exposed as high as the elbow. So again, another sentence where we don't know what the mark is. It's like, come on, tell us already. About halfway up the forearm was a curious brown design, a triangle inside a circle, standing up in vivid relief upon the lard-colored skin. It's not tattooed, said the doctor, peering through his glasses. I never saw anything like it. The man has been branded at some time as they brand cattle. What is the meaning of this? So, we learn that he has been branded with the symbol of the Deathly Hallows. I don't profess to know the meaning of it, said Cecil Barker, but I have seen the mark on Douglas many times this last 10 years. And so have I, said the butler. Many a time when the master has rolled up his sleeves, I have noticed that very mark. I've often wondered what it could be. So again, everyone's confused. Everyone doesn't know what this mark is. So the reader also feels that tension, also feels that mystery. It's brought up. This newcomer, the Dr. Wood, is like, what is this? And it turns out no one knows what it is. And then we remember that the wife was a little bit untrusting of her husband. And now we learn that there's this like mark, this brand, not quite a tattoo, but sort of like this mystery about him. So like we're building upon all these little things, and we're in confusion, we're in darkness the whole time. I've often wondered what it could be. Then it has nothing to do with the crime anyhow, said the sergeant, but it's a rum thing all the same. Everything about this case is rum. Well, what is it now? The butler had given an exclamation of astonishment and was pointing at the dead man's outstretched hand. They've taken his wedding ring. His wedding... his wedding ring. His wedding ring, he gasped. What? Yes, indeed. Master always wore his plain gold wedding ring on the little finger of his left hand. That ring, with the rough nugget on it, was above it, and the twisted snake ring on the third finger. There's the nugget and there's the snake, but the wedding... Oh my god. The wedding ring is gone. He's right, said Barker. Do you tell me, said the sergeant, that the wedding ring was below the other? Always. Then the murderer, or whoever it was, first took off this ring you call the nugget ring, then the wedding ring, and afterwards put the nugget ring back again. That is so. The worthy country policeman shook his head. Seems to me the sooner we get London on this case, the better, said he. White Mason is a smart man. No local job has ever been too much for White Mason. Won't be long now before he's here to help us. But I expect we'll have to look to London before we are through. Anyhow, I'm not ashamed to say that this is a deal too thick for the likes of me. Okay, so I'm going to look at how long this chapter is, and hopefully it's not half an hour long. Okay, I'll just say it was long, but I think we can. It's not like I have anywhere to go. Chapter 4. 3 morning, the chief detective, obeying the call from Sergeant Wilson of Burlstone, arrived from headquarters in a light dog cart behind a breathless trotter. By the 5:40 train in the morning, he had sent his message to Scotland Yard, and he was at the Burlstone station at 12 o'clock to welcome us. White Mason was a quiet, comfortable-looking person, in a loose tweed suit. I'm always nervous about tweed suits. To me, it just like reeks of criminal activity. With a clean-shaved, ruddy face, a stoutish body, and powerful bandy legs adorned with gaiters, looking like a small farmer, a retired gamekeeper, or anything upon earth except a very favorable specimen of the provincial criminal officer. All right, so we have another detective. Reputation. Because they said he always solves the cases. A downright snorter, Mr. MacDonald, he kept repeating. MacDonald is the one who Holmes is working with. We'll have the pressmen down like flies when they understand it. I'm hoping we will get our work done before they get poking their noses into it and messing up all the trails. There's been nothing like this that I can remember. There are some bits that will come home to you, Mr. Holmes, or I am mistaken. And you also, Dr. Watson. For the medicos will have a word to say before we finish. Your room is at Westville Arms. There's no other place, but I hear that it is clean and good. The man will carry your bags. This way, gentlemen, if you please. He was a very bustling and genial person, the Sussex detective. In 10 minutes, I guess we can say local detective. In 10 minutes, we had all found our quarters. In 10 more, we were seated in the parlor of the inn and being treated to a rapid sketch of those events which have been outlined in the previous chapter. This isn't quite breaking the fourth wall, uh, although it's very close, um, because this is a recollection of Watson's experiences, so he's almost writing it as though he were there and telling the story and writing it down in a diary or journal or whatever afterwards. MacDonald made an occasion. It is very risky, though, to point out, hey, we're actually reading a story. You're not in a story. You're not living the story. This is a telling. So he doesn't do this very often where he self-references, but I'm making more of a big deal than it is. But generally, you don't want to like remind your readers that they're reading a story. They just want to have the story. They just want to experience the story. They don't want to be reminded that they're being told of an experience of a story. Okay. MacDonald made an occasional note while Holmes sat absorbed with the expression of surprised and reverent admiration with which the botanist surveys the rare and precious bloom. Remarkable, he said, when the story was unfolded. Most remarkable. I can hardly recall any case where the features have been more peculiar. I thought you would say so, Mr. Holmes, said White Mason in great delight. We're well up with the times in Sussex. I've told you now how matters were, up to the time where I took over from Sergeant Wilson between 3 and 4 this morning. My word, I made the old mare go. But I need not have been in such a hurry, as it turned out, for there was nothing immediate that I could do. Sergeant Wilson had all the facts. I checked them and considered them and maybe added a few of my own. What were they? Asked Holmes eagerly. Well, I first had the hammer examined. There was Dr. Wood there to help me. We found no signs of violence upon it. I was hoping that if Mr. Douglas defended himself with the hammer, he might have left his mark upon the murderer before he dropped it on the mat. But there was no stain. That, of course, proves nothing at all, remarked Inspector MacDonald. There has been many a hammer murder with no trace on the hammer. Quite so. It doesn't prove it wasn't used, but there might have been stains, and that would have helped us. As a matter of fact, there were none. Then I examined the gun. They were buckshot cartridges, and, as Sergeant Wilson pointed out, the triggers were wired together, so that if you pulled on the hinder one, both barrels were discharged. Whoever fixed that up made up his mind that he was going to take no chances of missing his man. The sawed gun was not more than 2 foot long. One could carry it easily under one's coat. There was no complete maker's name, but the printed letters P-E-N were on the fluting between the barrels, and the rest of the name had been cut off by the saw. A big P with a flourish above it, E and N smaller? Asked Holmes. Exactly. Pennsylvania Small Arms Company, well-known American firm, said Holmes. White Mason gazed at my friend as the little village practitioner looks at the Harley Street specialist who by a word can solve the difficulties that perplex him. That is very helpful, Mr. Holmes. No doubt you are right. Wonderful, wonderful. Do you carry the names of all the gun makers in the world in your memory? Holmes dismissed the subject with a wave. No doubt it is an American shotgun, White Mason continued. I seem to have read that a sawed-off shotgun is a weapon used in some parts of America. Apart from the name upon the barrel, the idea had occurred to me. There is some evidence, then, that this man who entered the house and killed its master was an American. MacDonald shook his head. Man, you are surely traveling overfast, said he. I have heard no evidence yet that the stranger was ever in the house at all. The open window, the blood on the sill, the queer car, the marks of boots in the corner, the gun. Nothing there that could not have been arranged. Mr. Douglas was an American, or had lived long in America. So had Mr. Barker. You don't need You don't need to import an American from outside in order to account for American doings. Ames the butler? What about him? Is he reliable? Um, Something else that's striking me as we're reading this is how the the flow of the conversation. It's not as one would expect it, right? You're like, oh, we've learned he's an American murderer. And they're like, no, 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 wait a second. We don't know this yet. All these things could be done afterwards. Like power dynamics is something that happens a lot. It's like, who's in charge of the conversation? And the way to make conversations engaging is either to put them in like situations where conversation is difficult. So like if you're fighting on the edge of a cliff, like having a conversation there is difficult, right? That the words mean more if like one false step means you could fall off. If you get surprised by a phrase, you can fall off. Or if the power dynamics are changing, if who's in charge of the conversation is changing, or if people are being proven wrong back and forth, like who's actually correct in the conversation. Like you hold on to every word when you thought the conversation was going to go one way and then surprised it's actually the other way. 10 years ago, with Sir Charles Chandos, as solid as a rock. He has been with Douglas ever since he took the manor house 5 years ago. He has never seen a gun of this sort in the house. The gun was made to conceal. That's why the barrels were sawed. It would fit into any box. How could he swear there was no such gun in the house? Well, anyhow, he had never seen one. MacDonald shook his obstinate Scotch head. I'm not convinced yet that there was ever anyone in the house, said he. I'm asking you to consider. His accent became more Aberdonian as he lost himself in his argument. Again, this is the type of thing where you know that he's Scotch because of these accents. You've seen before where they replaced the letter I with double E. This happened in the first chapter or whatever. It's just little things like this that you know who's talking just based on these little details. I'm asking you to consider what it involves if you suppose that the gun was ever brought into the house and that all these strange things were done by a person from outside. Oh man, it's just inconceivable. It's clean against common sense. I put it to you, Holmes, judging it by what we have heard. Well, state your case, Mr. Mac, said Holmes in his most judicial style. The man is not a burglar, supposing that he ever existed. The ring business and the card point to premeditated murder for some private reason. Very good. Here's a man who slips into a house with the deliberate intention of committing murder. He knows, if he knows anything, that he will have a difficulty in making his escape, as the house is surrounded with water. What weapon would he choose? You would say the most silent in the world. Then he could hope when the deed was done to slip away quickly from the window, to wade the moat, and to get away at his leisure. That's understandable. But is it understandable that he should go out of his way to bring with him the most noisy weapon that he could select, knowing well that it would fetch every human being in the house to the spot as quick as they can run, and that it is all odds that he will be seen before he can get across the moat? Is that credible, Mr. Holmes? Well, you put the case strongly, my friend replied thoughtfully. It certainly needs a good deal of justification. May I ask, Mr. White Mason, whether you examined the farther side of the moat at once to see if there are any signs of the man having climbed out from the water? There were no signs, Mr. Holmes, but it is a stone ledge, and one could hardly expect them. No tracks or marks? None. Ha! Would there be any objection, Mr. White Mason, to our going down to the house at once? There may possibly be some small point which might be suggestive. I was going to propose it, Mr. Holmes, but I thought it well to put you in touch with all the facts before we go. I suppose if anything should strike you. White Mason looked doubtfully at the amateur. I have worked with Mr. Holmes before, said Inspector MacDonald. He plays the game. My own idea of the game, at any rate, said Holmes with a smile. I go into a case to help the ends of justice and the work of the police. If I have ever separated myself from the official force, it is because they have first separated themselves from me. I have no wish ever to score at their expense. At the same time, Mr. White Mason, I claim the right to work in my own way and give my results on my own time, complete rather than in stages. I am sure we are honored by your presence, and to show you all we know, said White Mason cordially. Come along, Dr. Watson, and when the time comes, we'll all hope for a place in your book. While realistic, like if this was actually happening, if he was actually recording these things, it makes sense to reference the book. But again, it does jar me a little bit because I was fully into it. I was ready to go on to the next chapter or the next paragraph, not even thinking about anything to analyze because I was just enjoying reading. And I'm like, oh, we're still in a book. We walked down the quaint village street with a row of pollard elms on each side of it. Just beyond were two ancient stone pillars, weather-stained and lichen-blotched, bearing upon their summits a shapeless something, which had once been the rampant lion of Capus of Burlstone. I bet that's said differently. A short walk along the winding drive with such sward and oaks around it as one only sees in rural England, then a sudden turn, and the long, low Jacobean house of dingy, liver-colored brick lay before us, with an old-fashioned garden of cut yews on each side of it. Whenever I think of yews, I think of RuneScape. As we approached it, there was the wooden drawbridge and the beautiful broad moat, as still and luminous as quicksilver in the cold winter sunshine. 3 centuries had flowed past the old manor house, centuries of births and of homecomings, of country dances and of meetings of fox hunters. Strange that now, in its old age, this dark business should have cast its shadow upon the venerable walls. And yet those strange peaked roofs and quaint overhung gables were a fitting covering to a grim and terrible intrigue. As I looked at the deep-set windows and the long sweep of the dull-colored water-lap front, I felt that no more fitting scene could be set for such a tragedy. The author did something here that I don't know how he did it, but there were definitely like moments where I was like, okay, I'm kind of like zoning out. I'm not really like flowed past homecoming dances, blah blah blah, and then like dark business, and then I was like strange peaked roofs, okay, grim and terrible intrigue. Like he kept drawing me back at the last possible second. So anyway, that's the window, said White Mason, that one on the immediate right of the drawbridge. It's open just as it was found last night. It looks rather narrow for a man to pass. Well, it wasn't a fat man, anyhow. We don't need your deductions, Mr. Holmes, to tell us that, but you or I could squeeze through all right. Oof. So again, we are used to having Watson just sing praises to Holmes all the time. And then it's a little bit of a change up, right? We don't need your deductions to tell us that. It makes the like this could be a much more boring conversation if it was just like, it looks rather narrow for a man to pass. You're right. Like okay, cool conversation, right? But here we just have this little extra twist to it. Nothing is as simple as you want it to be. Holmes walked to the edge of the moat and looked across. Then he examined the stone ledge and the grass border beyond it. I've had a good look, Mr. Holmes, said White Mason. There is nothing there, no sign that anyone has landed. But why should he leave any sign? Exactly, why should he? Is the water always turbid? Generally about this color. The stream brings down the clay. How deep is it? About 2 feet at each side and 3 in the middle. So we can put aside all idea of the man having been drowned in the crossing. No, a child could not be drowned in it. Well, this guy's never had a baby before. We walked across the drawbridge and were admitted by a quaint, gnarled, dried-up person who was the butler, Ames. So this is a dynamic, right? We had never had this description of Ames before. We only heard references to Ames from other people who had known him already. They knew he was reliable and with him in America or whatever. But now for the first time we have Watson examining him, and he is this quaint, dried up little man. Or maybe he's not little, but just it serves a good purpose for different characters to observe different things, and it lets you extend out your descriptions. You don't have all your description all at once from every single perspective. That's very chunky and laggy and gross, because you don't want to just read a description about a person for 3 paragraphs. But if you sprinkle in all these things throughout the thing, you get the same details, but you also get the different opinions and different mindsets of the people who are making these observations. The poor old fellow was white and quivering from the shock. The village sergeant, a tall, formal, melancholy man, still held his vigil in the room of fate. The doctor had departed. Anything fresh, Sergeant Wilson? Asked White Mason. No, sir. Then you can go home. You've had enough. We can send for you if we want you. This guy is very crisp and precise and very, I don't know, rude. It might be rude. He's just no nonsense, no pleasantries. We can send for you if we want you. Just get out of here. The butler had better wait outside. Tell him to warn Mr. Cecil Barker, Mrs. Douglas, and the housekeeper that we may want a word with them presently. Now, gentlemen, perhaps you will allow me to give you the views I have formed first, and then you will be better to arrive at your own. He impressed me, this country specialist. He had a solid grip of fact and a cool, clear, common-sense brain, which should take him some way in his profession. Holmes listened to him intently, with no sign of that impatience which the official exponent too often produced. It is suicide, or is it murder? That's our first question, gentlemen, is it not? If it were suicide, then we have to believe that this man began by taking off his wedding ring and concealing it, that he then came down here in his dressing gown, trampled mud into a corner behind the curtain in order to give the idea that someone had waited for him, opened the window, put blood on the... We can surely dismiss that, said MacDonald. So I think. Suicide is out of the question. Then a murder has been done. What we have to determine is whether it was done by someone outside or inside the house. Well, let's hear the argument. So it's not super clear who that is, but we can mostly deduce that because MacDonald is talking in short sentences, he's the one who's listening to White Mason, that he's continues saying, let's hear the argument. But it also doesn't really matter whether this is Holmes or MacDonald, right? They're both after the same information. It could even be Watson at this point. It doesn't matter to us who's asking to hear the argument. So why even put the dialogue tag there? Shave off those letters, shave off those words. There are considerable difficulties both ways, and yet one or the other it must be. We will suppose first that some person or persons inside the house did the crime. They got this man down here at a time when everything was still and yet no one was asleep. They then did the deed with the queerest and noisiest weapon in the world, so as to tell everyone what had happened. A weapon that was never seen in the house before. That does not seem like a very likely start, does it? No, it does not. Well, then, everyone has agreed that after the alarm was given, only a minute at the most had passed for the whole household, not Mr. Cecil Barker alone, though he claims to have been the first, but Ames and all of them were on the spot. Do you tell me that in that time the guilty person managed to make footmarks in the corner, open the window, mark the sill with blood, take the wedding ring off the dead man's finger, and all the rest of it? It's impossible. You put it very clearly, said Holmes. I am inclined to agree with you. Why do they keep saying that the footmarks had to be in the corner? I thought we established that he might have been there, standing there for a while first. So here's where me, not in the conversation, comes up with my own idea. Now I'm told, like, wait a second, he could have made the marks first. He could have like asked Douglas to like take off his ring before he shot him. These sorts of things. So now, like, as a reader, I want to hear these stories. I want to hear what else is happening in the rest of this conversation to try to figure out like why my hypotheses aren't accurate, or if they are accurate, like when will the characters in the story figure them out. So now I, as a reader, am engaged with my own thoughts, my own imagination, because we're told that like the two main ways, according to the characters in the story, see it are impossible. So now it's inviting the reader, inviting Holmes, inviting everyone involved to come up with new ideas. And so I immediately came up with one where he was hiding in the corner. That's why his footprints were there. The ring was asked to be taken off, or was taken off earlier. That sort of thing. Maybe he had a fight with his wife, and he's like, "You're a widower. I don't want you to wear my ring anymore," type of thing. We don't know. You put it very clearly, said Holmes. I am inclined to agree with you. Well then, we are driven back to the theory that it was done by someone from outside. We are still faced with some big difficulties, but anyhow, they have ceased to be impossibilities. The man got into the house between 4:30 and 6. That is to say, between dusk and the time when the bridge was raised. There had been some visitors, and the door was open, so there was nothing to prevent him. He may have been a common burglar, or he may have had some private grudge against Mr. Douglas. Since Mr. Douglas has spent most of his life in America, and the shotgun seems to be an American weapon, it would seem that the private grudge is the more likely theory. He slipped into this room because it was the first he came to, and he hid behind the curtain. There he remained until past 11 at night. At that time, Mr. Douglas entered the room. It was a short interview, if there were any interview at all, for Mrs. Douglas declares that her husband had not left her more than a few minutes when she heard the shot. The candle shows that, said Holmes. Something about this also reminded me of Professor Moriarty. Like, why are we told about Professor Moriarty? Like, we're talking about a personal grudge, a private grudge, but earlier in the story we're told about Moriarty. So again, my imagination is like running, right? It's inviting the mystery into my own mind. Exactly. The candle, which was a new one, is not burned more than half an inch. He must have placed it on the table before he was attacked. Otherwise, of course, it would have fallen when he fell. This shows that he was not attacked the instant that he entered the room. When Mr. Barker arrived, the candle was lit and the lamp was out. That's all clear enough. Well, now we can reconstruct things on those lines. Mr. Douglas enters the room. He puts down the candle. A man appears from behind the curtain. He is armed with this gun. He demands the wedding ring. Heaven only knows why, but so it must have been. Mr. Douglas gave it up. Then, either in cold blood or in the course of a struggle, Douglas may have gripped the hammer that was found upon the mat. He shot Douglas in this horrible way. He dropped his gun, and also would seem this queer card, VV341, whatever that means. And he made his escape through the window and across the moat at the very moment when Cecil Barker was discovering the crime. How's that, Mr. Holmes? Very interesting, but just a little unconvincing. Man, it would be absolute nonsense if it wasn't that anything else is even worse. cried MacDonald. Somebody killed the man, and whoever it was, I could clearly prove to you that he should have done it in some other way. What does he mean by allowing his retreat to be cut off like that? What does he mean by using a shotgun when silence was his one chance of escape? Come, Mr. Holmes, it's up to you to give us a lead, since you say Mr. White Mason's theory is unconvincing. Holmes had sat intently observant during this long discussion, missing no word that was said, with his keen eyes darting right and to the left, and his forehead wrinkled with speculation. I should like a few more facts before I get so far as a theory, Mr. Mack, said he, kneeling down beside the body. Dear me, these injuries are really appalling. Can we have the butler in for a moment? Ames, I understand that you often seen this very unusual mark, a branded triangle inside a circle, upon Mr. Douglas's forearm. Frequently, sir. You've never heard any speculation as to what it meant? No, sir. It must have caused great pain when it was inflicted. It is undoubtedly a burn. Now I observe, Ames, that there is a small piece of plaster at the angle of Mr. Douglas's jaw. Did you observe that in life? Plaster is what they used to use. They used to be bandages. Instead of having band-aids that like have this nice tape and padding and everything, they used to just put plaster over it. Did you observe that in life? Yes, sir. He cut himself in shaving yesterday morning. Did you ever know him to cut himself shaving before? Not in a very long time, sir. Suggestive, said Holmes. It may of course be a mere coincidence, or it may point to some nervousness, which would indicate that he had reason to apprehend danger. Had you noticed anything unusual in his conduct yesterday, Ames? It struck me that he was a little restless and excited, sir. Ha! The attack may not have been entirely unexpected. We do seem to make a little progress, do we not? Perhaps you would rather do the questioning, Mr. Mack. No, Mr. Holmes, it's in better hands than mine. Well then, we will pass to this card, VV341. It is rough cardboard. Have you any sort of in the house? Any of this kind of cardboard in the house? I don't think so. Holmes walked across the desk and dabbed a little ink from each bottle onto the blotting paper. It was not printed in this room, he said. This is black ink and the other purplish. It was done by a thick pen, and these are fine. No, it was done elsewhere, I should say. Can you make anything of the inscription, Ames? No, sir, nothing. What do you think, Mr. Mack? It gives me the impression of a secret society of some sort. The same with this badge upon his forearm. That's my idea, too, said White Mason. Well, we can adopt it as a working hypothesis, and then see how far our difficulties disappear. An agent from such a society makes his way into the house, waits for Mr. Douglas, blows his head nearly off with this weapon, and escapes by wading the moat, after leaving a card beside the dead man, which will, when mentioned in the papers, tell other members of the society that vengeance has been done. That all hangs together. But why this gun of all weapons? Exactly. And why the missing ring? Quite so. And why no arrest? It's past 2 now. I take it for granted that since dawn every constable within 40 miles has been looking out for a wet stranger. That is so, Mr. Holmes. Well, unless he has a burro close by or a change of clothes ready, they can hardly miss him. And yet they have missed him up to now. Holmes had gone to the window and was examining with his lens the blood mark on the sill. It is clearly the tread of a shoe. It is remarkably broad, a splay foot, one would say. Curious, because so far as one can trace any footmark in this mud-stained corner, one could say it was a more shapely sole. However, they are certainly very indistinct. What's this under the side table? So we're getting all these little details. You can skim over this, but noticing that the shoes in the corner are different than the shoe on the windowsill, the fact that one's bloody, the one's muddy, these all point to like inconsistencies. And like even from like the perspective of Barker setting this all up, he couldn't have done that if he had different shoes. Like it's all very lots of loose ends right now. What's this under the side table? Mr. Douglas's dumbbells, said Ames. Dumbbell? There's only one. Where's the other? I don't know, Mr. Holmes. There may have only been one. I have not noticed them for months. One dumbbell, Holmes said seriously, but his remarks were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. A tall, sunburned, capable-looking, clean-shaven man looked in at us. I had no difficulty in guessing that it was the Cecil Barker of whom I had heard. His masterful eyes traveled quickly with a questioning glance from face to face. Sorry to interrupt your consultation, said he, but you should hear the latest news. An arrest? No such luck. But they found his bicycle. The fellow left his bicycle behind him. Come and have a look. It is within 100 yards of the hall door. We found 3 or 4 grooms and idlers standing in the drive inspecting a bicycle which had been drawn out from a clump of evergreens in which had been concealed. It was a well-used Rudge Whitworth, splashed as from a considerable journey. There was a saddlebag with spanner and oil can, but no clue as to the owner. It would be a grand help to the police, said the inspector, if these things were numbered and registered, but we must be thankful for what we've got. Hey, they do that for cars eventually, but not guns. If we can't find where he went to, at least we are likely to get where he came from. But what in the name of all that is wonderful made the fellow leave it behind? And how in the world has he got away without it? We don't seem to get a gleam of light in the case, Mr. Holmes. Don't we? My friend answered thoughtfully. I wonder. Whew. Okay. So, that about does it for today. I haven't dropped any frames in a while, it looks like, so I'm glad that at least the last few minutes were clear, hopefully, for you guys. Yeah, we are getting into the thick of the story. It's weird commentating on stuff outside of the actual story because the story changes every time. Like, it's easy to commentate on the story, but commentating on the writing style and everything, I'm going to sound redundant day after day, but I guess that's part of the streaming life. As you do the same thing over and over again, answer the same questions by new people in chat over and over again. But yeah, anyway, that does it for me. Hope you're all doing well. There will be a VOD for this. I might be able to stream tomorrow. Depends on what happens. But yeah, take care and down with Big Brother.